It all started the year I turned 18. I don't know why, but something about that age, when you're no longer quite a kid but not entirely an adult, seemed to make the world more strange. At least, that's how I felt as things began to unravel at my home in Pine Hollow, a small town with a population barely pushing 2,000. I still don't have answers for what happened, but I've spent years thinking about it. I call it the mimic. My house in Pine Hollow wasn't anything special, just a modest, old two-story structure at the edge of town. It had the usual creaks, the occasional draft, and the kind of character you'd expect from a place built in the early 1900s. But that year, the house didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like something was watching me, listening to me. Whenever my mom and older sister, Rachel, would go into town, I'd be home alone. I actually liked it. It was quiet, peaceful. But then, the mimic started. It would happen the same way every time. I'd be lying in bed or watching TV, and I'd hear the front door open. Keys jingling, the sound of the lock clicking open, the scrape of the old door swinging wide. The dogs, two mutts we adopted from a shelter, would charge toward the door, barking like mad, expecting to greet Mom or Rachel. And then I'd hear it, a voice, my mom's voice. "Hush, Bella. Quiet, Max. It's just me." Just the usual. Except it wasn't. I'd get up, thinking they were home, but the house would be empty. No one in the living room, no one at the door. Nothing. Just silence. The dogs, having already calmed down, would be lying on the floor, totally unconcerned. It was so unsettling that at first, I convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing, but the mimic wasn't content with just being some figment of my imagination. One day, I decided to test it. I was in my room, studying for finals. Mom and Rachel had gone to visit my aunt in the next town over, so I knew I was alone. Then, just like always, I heard the front door, keys, the lock, the door. The dogs sprang up, barking in excitement. I didn't move this time. Instead, I grabbed my phone and called my mom. "Hey, where are you guys?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay calm. "We're still at Aunt Sarah's," she replied, oblivious. "Why? Something wrong?" "No, it's just nothing. Never mind." I hung up and stayed put, waiting for the sound of footsteps, of voices. But there was nothing. Eventually, the dogs settled down, and I didn't move from my room for the rest of the night. That should have been the end of it, but the mimic had other plans. One night, after my mom had surgery and was recovering at my grandparents' house, I took the dogs out for a walk. When I came back, I heard it again, the same keys, the lock, the front door creaking open. But this time, it was different. My mom's dog, Shelby, who had been fast asleep in her room, started barking. Then, just as always, I heard my mom's voice, clear as day. "Max, stop barking." And just like that, Max stopped, as if she'd been scolded by my actual mother. But my mom wasn't home. I stood there, frozen, every hair on my neck standing on end. I couldn't believe what I'd just heard. My mom was miles away, healing from surgery, yet here was her voice, clear and authoritative, as if she were right there in the house with me. The dog seemed to buy it, but I didn't. I ran to her room, expecting to see her sitting on her bed, but the room was empty. Everything felt wrong. At that point, I stopped calling it a coincidence. It was something else. Something I didn't understand. Something that had learned the voices of my family, and for some reason, it was using them. There were other strange occurrences in the house. Small things at first. Knocking sounds, always coming from inside the walls. I could replicate it exactly by knocking with my knuckle against the drywall, but there was no explanation for why or how it was happening. I tried to ignore it. I even convinced myself it was just the old house settling. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. One day, I was feeling sick and had decided to rest in bed. Rachel had just left to spend time with her boyfriend, and my mom was at work. As soon as I laid down, the knocking started again, louder this time. A persistent, rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from inside the walls. I grabbed my phone and called Rachel in tears. "Something's wrong," I sobbed. There's knocking in the walls." Rachel rushed home, but the moment she opened the front door, the knocking stopped, like it had been waiting for her to leave. She checked on me, made sure I was okay, and then left again. And just like clockwork, the knocking resumed as soon as she walked out the door. It felt like the house was playing games with me, waiting, watching. Things escalated a few months later. I had rearranged my room, pushing my bed against the closet door, partly because I thought it would make the room feel cozier, but mostly because I had become irrationally afraid of the closet. Anytime I was leaning against it for too long, I would hear and feel the vibrations, what I can only describe as claws scratching down the inside of the closet door, trying to get out. I'll never forget that sound. The scraping, like something with long, sharp nails was trapped inside, desperate to escape. It only happened a few times before I moved my bed away, but the memory stayed with me. I started piling boxes and bags in front of the closet, hoping that whatever was in there wouldn't be able to get out. Even with all the clutter pressed against the door, I could still hear the faint scratching, always at night, when the rest of the house was quiet. It wasn't just the closet, though. One night, I was lying in bed, my arm hanging over the side, when a loud bang echoed across the room. It sounded like someone had punched my dresser hard. I jumped back, yanking my hand onto the bed. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought it might burst from my chest. A few seconds later, the entire bed started to shake, vibrating violently as if something was underneath, pushing it up. I was too scared to move. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was just an earthquake or some random house noise. But I knew better. The worst part wasn't even in that house. It was the place we moved to next, a seemingly peaceful, suburban home. But peace was an illusion. A few weeks after we moved in, I was outside talking to one of our new neighbors when she casually mentioned that I had a thing for older men. I stared at her, confused, and asked what she meant. "Oh, you know," she said. "I saw you last night, standing by your window. There was an older man behind you, probably in his 60s. Seemed odd for someone your age, but hey, I'm not judging." My blood turned to ice. There was no man. I lived alone with my mom, and no one had been in my room, let alone some strange older man. I thanked the neighbor and went straight back inside, locking every window and door. A few days later, the attic door in my room started acting up. It had a latch that we kept locked, but the latch would constantly fall open on its own. One day, it wouldn't stay latched at all. The door kept slamming open and closed, over and over, right in front of me, like something was trapped inside and was furiously trying to get out. I remember standing there, watching the door slam repeatedly for what felt like forever. Eventually, it stopped, but I never felt safe in that house again. Every night, I'd hear the faint sound of footsteps in the attic, heavy, like someone wearing boots. It wasn't just me. My little sister, Claire, who was only 3 at the time, started waking up in the middle of the night, screaming at the top of her lungs. It wasn't a normal kind of scream either. It was pure terror. My mom would rush in, and Claire would be clinging to her, staring wide-eyed at the window, as if she could see something we couldn't. One night, after Claire had learned to speak in full sentences, she pointed at the window and whispered, "Run. Run, Mommy." That was the last straw. We packed up and left that house for good. To this day, I don't know what the mimic was, or why it targeted us, but I'm just grateful it didn't follow us to our new home. Wherever it is now, I hope it stays far away. Growing up, I had this friend, Nathan, who lived in a small lakeside town called Silver Lake Pines, a hidden little spot in the Midwest where the water stretched out like a mirror on a still day. His family lived right by the docks, managing the boats and cabins around the shore. Nathan had 2 older brothers, Ethan and Caleb, and together, the 3 of them took care of the day-to-day while their mom handled the business side of things. One late autumn evening, we were gathered around a crackling campfire down by the lake's edge. The wind was starting to pick up, making the flames dance, and I could hear the soft lapping of the water on the shore. Nathan's brothers joined us, and before long, we were passing around stories about the lake. It was Ethan who first mentioned the town beneath the water. "You know, there's a whole town down there," he said, leaning forward, eyes gleaming in the firelight. "Buried under Silver Lake." I raised an eyebrow. "A town? Really?" Caleb, who was always the quieter one, nodded slowly. "It's true. It used to be a valley. The old townsfolk were relocated when they flooded it. Rich folks wanted a private lake for their summer homes. Now it's just sitting down there, forgotten. There was something in Caleb's tone that made me uneasy, but I shook it off, chalking it up to typical spooky campfire vibes. I smirked and asked, "So if there's a town down there, what else has been going on in this place? I mean, you guys have lived here your whole lives. Gotta have some good ghost stories." The brothers exchanged looks. Nathan, who usually laughed at this kind of stuff, just stared into the fire. It was then that Ethan spoke up again, and his voice had a weight to it that silenced the night around us. "It's not a ghost story. Not really. It's about the room at the back of the house." My curiosity piqued. I glanced over my shoulder at the old log cabin they lived in. From where we sat, you could barely make out the back room in the dim light. It was an add-on, probably built decades after the main structure, raised up on stilts to match the rest of the house. "What about it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Nathan took a deep breath. "That room, it's different, always colder than the rest of the house. You can feel it, even in summer. But it's not just the cold. There's something in there. Something that hates people." Ethan nodded. Every time someone stayed in that room, they'd wake up in the middle of the night, feeling like someone was watching them. They'd hear whispers, hissing, like someone was right next to them. A few guests even said they were slapped awake by something. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. "Slapped?" "Yeah," Caleb added quietly, his eyes still fixed on the fire. "And nobody ever stayed the whole night. They'd always end up on the couch in the living room by morning." I tried to laugh it off, but the uneasy tension around the campfire made it impossible. Still, the skeptic in me wasn't convinced. "I mean, it could just be the cold. Drafty room, bad insulation. Maybe the house is just settling." Nathan's face darkened, and I could see the genuine fear in his eyes. "We thought that too. Until we saw her." "Her?" My heart skipped a beat. Ethan leaned in, lowering his voice. "The girl by the lake." It was clear that this was more than just a casual ghost story to them. Nathan shifted in his seat, as though remembering something he didn't want to think about. I couldn't help but press on, the mix of intrigue and dread growing inside me. "What happened?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Nathan hesitated, but Ethan jumped in. "It started when we were out fishing at night, maybe 2 years ago. Me and Caleb were casting lines, and we saw this light. It was pale, like moonlight, but flickering, almost like it was alive. At first, we thought it was just someone else out there, noodling or setting traps. But it wasn't. It was moving," Caleb continued, his voice tight. "But not on the shore. It was halfway up the cliffside. Just floating." My skin crawled at the thought. "Floating?" Ethan nodded. "It was a girl, or at least it looked like one. Long white dress, maybe a nightgown, and she was barefoot. But she was wrong. Something was off about her. She had no face." A chill ran down my spine as I imagined it. A girl drifting along the sheer cliff, featureless, like some kind of nightmare. "You guys saw this with your own eyes?" Nathan finally spoke, his voice strained. "More than once. It wasn't just a one-time thing. She kept coming back. Always at night. Always by the cliffs or the shore. And the closer we looked, the worse it got." Ethan took over. "One night, we decided to follow her. It was around 3 a.m., and she was close enough to the shoreline for us to approach her in the boat. We called out, but she didn't stop. Just kept floating. We circled in front of her, and that's when we saw her face. Or, I should say, the lack of it. No eyes, no mouth. Caleb whispered. Just smooth skin where her face should have been. At that point, I felt a lump forming in my throat. Part of me wanted to call their bluff, but there was something about the way they were telling the story that made it impossible. They weren't trying to scare me. They were reliving it. "What did you do?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Ethan leaned back, his eyes hollow. "We got the hell out of there. But she kept coming back, always the same. We tried to tell ourselves it was just the lake playing tricks on us, but deep down, we knew it was something else. Something real." A heavy silence fell over the campfire, broken only by the crackling of the wood and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Something darker. "And the room?" I asked, glancing back at the cabin. Nathan swallowed hard. We think they're connected. The girl in the room. It's like, whatever's out there, by the lake, it wants inside. A few nights later, curiosity got the best of me. I was staying over at Nathan's place, and despite every warning, I found myself alone in the back room. I tried to play it cool, telling myself it was just an old house, nothing more. But as soon as I stepped into that room, I felt it, the cold. It was the middle of summer, but it was freezing, like walking into a meat locker. The bed was old and creaky, with worn sheets that smelled faintly of mildew. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, trying to fall asleep. But the cold was biting, almost unbearable. I could hear the wind outside, but that wasn't the worst part. It was the feeling, the overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. Then I heard it. A soft knock, like someone tapping on the wall beside me. My heart raced, and I froze, listening intently. Another knock, this time louder. It was coming from inside the wall. I bolted upright in bed, my breath catching in my throat. The room was dark, but I could just make out the silhouette of the window, the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, as if something was trying to get out. I wanted to run, to leave the room and never come back. But something held me there, paralyzed with fear. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. I sat there, heart pounding, waiting for something else to happen. And that's when I felt it, a cold, bony hand brushing against my ankle, slipping out from under the bed. I screamed and bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. The rest of the house was dark and silent, and I could hear the soft snores of Nathan and his brothers from their rooms. I wanted to wake them, to tell them what had happened, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I huddled on the couch, pulling the blanket tight around me, and prayed for morning. When dawn finally broke, I packed up my things and left. I never told Nathan what I saw, and I never stayed in that room again. But even now, years later, I still dream about that faceless girl, drifting along the shore of Silver Lake, waiting for someone to follow her. The story of Silver Lake never left me. It haunted my thoughts in ways I couldn't explain, a lingering dread that sat in the pit of my stomach. To this day, I wonder what might have happened if I had stayed in that room just a little longer. Would she have found me? Or was she waiting for something else? Something worse? One thing's for sure, I'll never go back. Not to that house, not to that lake. Late-night drives after shows can be a mix of excitement and exhaustion. It was around 2 a.m. when I was behind the wheel, my bandmates, Aaron, Doug, Tina, and Mitch, scattered in the van. We were coming back from a gig in Crescent Springs, the energy of the show still buzzing in the air. But as we hit Route 47, heading toward Blackwater Bridge, I could feel a shift in the atmosphere. The road was empty, the night silent except for the hum of our tires. I tried to shake off the unease creeping into my chest, but as we approached the bridge, that familiar sense of dread settled in. I focused on the dim glow of the streetlights, the dark expanse of Blackwater Lake stretching beneath us. When I crossed onto the bridge, a figure caught my eye, a man walking along the shoulder. My heart raced as I instinctively swerved, narrowly missing him. My bandmates jolted, their voices mingling with surprise. "What was that?" I heard someone say, but I couldn't afford to answer. I was too busy watching the figure in my rearview mirror. He wore a dark jacket, camo cargo pants, and had wet hair that hung limply around his face. A chill ran down my spine, but I forced a laugh, pretending it was just a trick of the light. As I focused on the road, I caught glimpses of him every few miles, each time his head turning to reveal that twisted grin. My stomach knotted tighter with each sighting. As I pressed the accelerator, I felt a desperate urge to escape whatever this was. "Guys, I think we need to go faster," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The others exchanged nervous glances, the mood shifting from playful to serious. I saw him again, standing a few feet ahead, his face illuminated by the headlights for a split second. Panic surged through me. This wasn't just in my head. The road ahead was a blur of trees as I weaved through the darkness, the oppressive silence weighing heavily in the air. The woods felt claustrophobic, the shadows pressing in closer as I fought to keep the van steady. I didn't want to look in the mirror anymore, but I couldn't help myself. I had to know if he was still there. Then came a moment that made my blood run cold. He was right in the middle of the road, grinning like he knew something we didn't. I swerved again, tires screeching as we nearly lost control. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out any thoughts of logic or reason. As we hurtled past the figure, I couldn't shake the image of him from my mind. I forced myself to look ahead, the headlights cutting through the darkness, praying we'd soon leave him behind. But with every mile, I could feel the weight of his gaze on us, like he was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we reached the outskirts of town. The familiar lights of Crescent Springs broke through the oppressive darkness, but the fear didn't lift. We drove the rest of the way in silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts, replaying what we'd seen. Once we parked outside my apartment, I glanced over my shoulder at the dark road behind us. Had it all been a figment of my imagination? The bridge loomed in my mind, a place where nightmares came to life. The night air felt heavier now, as if the memories of that figure still lingered, waiting to emerge from the shadows. Even now, whenever I drive over Blackwater Bridge, I keep my eyes peeled for that man. The memory of his wet hair, his dark clothes, and that unnerving grin haunt me. With each crossing, I push the gas pedal down a little harder, hoping to outrun the fear that still clings to me, waiting for the moment he reappears in the darkness.